on this episode of Therapy Bites Art Lab.
Differently able, psychology of valuing and empowering differences. T-ballers, do we have a problem that we can help you solve today? Did you or do you struggle with school, with learning new things or new skills, or maybe you think your brain is just a notch below others? Do you find yourself thinking sabotaging thoughts about your inabilities instead of focusing and maximizing your abilities? Well, today's guest is the teacher that your mama warned you about. She's kicking butt and slinging research. That's evidence-based research, that is, and that's not just the best kind, that's the only kind. She's slinging research to chip away at some long-held archaic foundations of what we always believe the brain can't do, and shedding some much-needed light of hope and clarity on all the brain is really capable of. Listen up if you have a disability physically, in memory, attention, comprehension, social interaction, because the bell is rung and school is in session. So everybody at your desk, and grab your spiral notebooks and number 2 pencils. It's time for class with Dr. Bibi Pirayesh. Coming up next on Therapy Bites Art Lab.
Stay tuned following the interview for On the Couch and Off the Rocker. Our special guest's psychosilly-analysis by Art Lab's own head cabbager, Dr. Ima Freudnot.
Welcome to Therapy Bites Art Lab, where Dr. Heath and his special guests share real-life stories of helping and healing, fresh from the actual therapy couch, while taking a bite out of common counseling missteps and misconceptions. And now, here's Heath and the T-Ball team.
Welcome, T-Ballers, to another great episode of Therapy Bites Art Lab, and the episode is on Differently Able, Psychology of Valuing and Empowering Differences with Dr. Bibi Pirayesh, who is a real-life neuroscientist, and I just play one on TV sometimes. Actually, my background is in psychology and forensic psychology, but Dr. B's got my butt kicked on that one. We're talking about the mechanics of learning disabilities, educational therapy, our cultured seeming fevered infection with what I call ableitis, and some strategies for you, parents, and the whole family when it comes to valuing and empowering differences. Why are we different? Because we're supposed to be. We're meant to be, but more on that next. Dr. Pirayesh holds a bachelor's degree in neuroscience and education from the University of Pittsburgh and a master's degree in developmental psychology from Columbia University, where her work focused primarily on children's development of mathematical thinking and cognitive, one of my favorite things, cognitive neuroscience. She's worked as a learning specialist and educational therapist in private practice for over a decade. The emphasis of her work is on remediating learning disabilities in a one-on-one setting, but she's a community activist and advocate for children and families around learning rights. Gosh, imagine that we have rights for learning. Don't we need that in the world today? She works with children grades 1 through 12 and covers a wide range of learning difficulties, including dyslexia, ADHD, and spectrum disorders. And we're talking about autism there. In 2020, Dr. Pirayesh launched The Difference is Not Deficit. I'll say that one more time because it's so cool. The Difference is Not Deficit project to help promote the importance of seeing learning disability as a social justice issue. In addition to her private practice and advocacy work, Dr. Paresh is also adjunct faculty at Pepperdine University and is involved with a number of service organizations, including the Association of Educational Therapists.
Stay in the stands at the end of the interview, T-ballers, and witness our special guest slug a bite-sized brain ball with your name all over it, clean out of the art lab.
And Dr. Bibi, it is such a pleasure to have you in the art lab today. Thanks for being here. Tell us, how did you get going on this battle for learning rights? And for those listening, why should we all care about that?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me and for the introduction. I think I came to educational therapy and sort of the field of special education, learning rights, all of this in a very different way than most people do. I came from a science background. I think most people come from an education teaching background. And my studies kind of in school were primarily aimed around understanding learning. And I sort of got to a point in my career where I was so confused about why everything that we understood and knew at the academic level wasn't getting passed on to classrooms. Like, why was there this disconnect between research and practice? And when I first started working with kids with learning disabilities, it was just sort of almost like research. I wanted to understand, we say in neuroscience, if you want to understand a process, look at it where it breaks down. And of course, for these kids, it was breaking down. But once I started to do that work, I really saw one place where we could connect the research and the practice. So, for example, around dyslexia, we know how to basically rebuild new neuronal connections. So someone who gets diagnosed with a learning disability in reading can learn how to read. And that's an incredible thing to see in a child. And so, over the years, I just became more and more concerned with the fact that this wasn't happening in most schools. Remediation doesn't happen in public schools. And then, of course, the issue that the way that things are set up, kids whose parents have the resources to get outside school support for them tend to be able to, use that support and succeed, and the kids who don't. And of course, that's a social justice issue. And so that's really how I began to get into these questions around learning disability as a social justice issue, but also, children's learning rights, because the way that our special education law is written, there is no, we don't consider being able to kind of reach your potential as a human right. It's just more around access. And so what I was seeing is that a lot of kids, as long as they have the minimal amount of access, the school system is like, we've done our job. But of course, these kids have potential to do so much more. And that never happens.
Wow. Well, I can already see that we need to have about an 8-hour conversation to really dig through all that. That is a lot of information. And I'm going to go back and pick up on, and thank you for that. I want to go back and pick up on something that our listeners may not be familiar with. I think that families hear this on a routine basis. And I think there's a reason behind that. By the way, just quickly, I think it's a liability reason. As a doctor, this sounds crazy, you're legally speaking, you're much safer to give bad news than to give hopeful news, because you won't be sued if stuff gets better. You'll be sued if stuff doesn't once you've, given hope. But I think a lot of our listeners think that it's kind of a one and done thing, and that kids really can't improve if they're in special ed classes. They'll be there forever, and they really don't have much of a future. What have you found in research that leads you to believe that the brain is so, as the term's come to be known, neuroplastic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that unfortunately, the field of education and psychology historically did a lot of damage by kind of putting forth this idea that, intelligence is something that's fixed. Not that learning disability has to do with intelligence, but, whatever, you're just sort of like a type of student. And, then we're just going to treat you based on how we've already categorized you. And I think the greatest contribution of the field of neuroscience to education in this sort of last, I would say, 50 years has been sort of the discovery of the fact that the brain is in fact plastic, and that it can continue to change, and that it's capable of really quite incredible change. So, we have all these studies of certain brain regions actually being removed, or, for example, if someone's in an accident, a part of their brain just no longer functioning, and then the rest of the brain coming in and changing the type of neuron that they are in order to compensate for that. So we know that the brain can do incredible things in really extreme situations. And I don't want to. One thing that's really important to me is that we don't look at disability as something that is like a deficit that needs to be cured or fixed. That's not the point. But the point is that we can't assume that what we see is going to be it forever. So in much more milder cases, for example, in terms of learning disability, we have, and any teacher could tell you this. I mean, any good teacher could tell you this. You don't have to be a brain scientist. We know that, through a certain kind of work, and, that work has to be intense, it has to be frequent, because that's the only way to build new neurons. But we know that children can learn to do things that they couldn't do before. And, one of our greatest areas of research that shows us this is in reading. We know that dyslexic students can build the reading circuit that they don't kind of naturally have like typical readers, and they can learn to read. So we know that. We just, for some reason, don't recognize that in order for that to happen, though, there has to be explicit teaching, there has to be frequent and intense work and practice, but it's definitely possible.
I think that you hit the nail on the head with what a lot of parents experience is that thing with disability is they think, again, it's kind of a one and done thing. They don't realize all the new research and science out there that's available to help their kid. And I'm not sure, I'm not finger pointing, I'm not sure whose fault that is. Maybe it's a little bit all the above. Parents, politicians, teachers. They say it takes a village to raise a child. I think it's going to take a nation to make a nation joining together on this to make a difference in the lives of these children. But I think one of the reasons that it doesn't get done in schools, and jump in because you're much more experienced at this than I am. I'm just kind of an outsider on this part of it. I think that we don't teach based on science. I think we teach based on tradition. I think whether we teach the way that we do in schools because that's how we've always taught. And I think that needs to change in that every lesson is taught based on science. The other thing that occurs to me that we need to do is, and I'm also not a business consultant, so to speak, in management, but I learned early on the difference between theory X and theory Y. And with theory X management, if you have a problem with an employee not doing their job, it is truly just a problem with the employee. What do? You throw away or get rid of the employee. With theory Y, and you management consultants, you can write me letters and call my hand on this. But in theory Y, it's my understanding that we step back and look at the system and ask, okay, what is it about the system which is keeping this employee from being successful? And do you think that's what kind of you need to do with students, is instead of expecting every student to be a carbon copy of every other student, to step back and say, well, this kid is differently abled. How can we organize a system around them where they can be more successful? Is that kind of some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a systemic issue. I don't necessarily think it's, budgeting, because we know that, our budget for special education is equal to our budget for regular education. So it's not so much about money even. I think, unfortunately, like you mentioned, one of the things that happens is in teacher training programs, we do not teach how learning happens. We do not teach, for all of our talk around child-centered this and that, we're not really teaching how the brain learns and develops, et cetera. We teach curriculum. That's what we teach. And
that curriculum is mandated by law, I guess, right?
Mandated by law, and it's very much based on not just a typical learner, but like what you would consider a very strong kind of linear academic learner, which so many kids do not fit. They're different types of, I don't want to say different kinds of learners, because that doesn't really neuroscientifically make sense, but they're differently, they come to things in a different way. And there's different things that they would, so for example, if our school system, was focused on doing really well in sports, all of the kids who are very academic would probably get labeled as disabled because they would, if they're not good at sports. So the issue is that we have a very narrow vision for education and what it means. And then anyone who doesn't fit into that, we just say, oh, there's something, kind of wrong with them. And then we sort of in our special education system tend to try and just kind of push them along and get them to the end and get them off of our plates in a way. So I don't think that we can really blame, individual teachers. But the bottom line is that our special education system is really aimed at accommodations and modifications and not really aimed at remediation. Now, for some kids, I don't want to give the impression that any student is going to be able to shift things and become a typical learner, nor should that be the goal. That shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be to kind of look at the variety and diversity of the kinds of brains that children bring us, and then to try and create an education system that is reflective of that. Whereas what we have today is we decide, and by we, I generally mean neurotypical people, we decide what is normal, what is right, and then all the children have to kind of reflect our values. And it's sort of that's what we really need to turn upside down, I think.
Oh, and I agree. I think it's very much a bell curve effect. For those of you that don't know, I'm on video here and I'm doing this thing where there's a peak in the middle, and to be normal, you really have to be kind of centered in the middle of the distribution. If you're in the tails of the distribution, either way, really, you're just an odd duck, and you get chopped off and left out. There's got to be a better way. But where are we missing the boat? Why can't we get there after studying it for so long and having all these big dollar government programs? Why can't we seem to tackle it and make a difference? What's holding us back?
Yeah, that is the $1 million question. I think, unfortunately, when I really try to dive into that question of, why is there this great divide between research and practice? And, it's a very complex answer, and there's, many different components. But I think one really big part of it is ideology. Culturally, ideologically, we have just this very hierarchical, meritocratic way of looking at everything. And, our education system reflects that. So I think to some extent, of course, things are changing. I think more and more we're really beginning to understand the importance of diversity. I think right now, for example, we're in a place where we're understanding that the type of skills that children need in the future are going to be very different than the types of skills that we're valuing and pushing in schools. And the types of students who have those skills might not be our A+ students in schools. So, we're kind of, I think, in this time in education, despite the fact that we're always in a crisis in education and we're always going under reforms and this and that. I think a lot of that is fueled by money. But I think we're really in a time right now where we're understanding that things are going to look different in the future, and I think that's a good thing. But I really think that it comes back to ideology, and I think a lot of it comes back to the economic order of the land. But I don't want to get into that too.
Yeah, that's a can of worms, isn't it?
Conversation.
No, I think that we put our money where we find meaning. And speaking of the tails of the distribution, you have on one end the very, very young, and the other end you have the very, very old. And we just have a culture that really doesn't value the very young, and it certainly doesn't value the very old. By the time you get to be 70, you're actually pretty worthless, aren't you? And that's ridiculous. These are human beings we're talking about.
Right. We have a culture that sort of values you, I think, based on your productivity. And you have productive years. And I think that the kids, that are not going to just easily fall into this system of kind of raising you to be productive are kind of seen as a problem. And we've changed a lot of the language. We don't call them, the words that we used to, or maybe isolate them in the way that we used to. But at the heart of it, our ideology is still the same, and that's reflected still.
I just think that the whole productivity thing is a bit of keeping our heads inside the box instead of thinking outside the box, because it kind of begs the question, what is productivity? And the way we humans think of things is, guess what? How we always think of things. How we think of things is going to be how we always think of things. And it's almost as if you can't turn a widget this direction this many times a minute, you're not productive. But I think that's underthinking. In the art lab, we had this term underthinking, because that's ignoring other aspects of the situation. We had a guest on the show a few weeks ago, fabulous couple of guys, father-son, John and Mark Cronin. John has Down syndrome and went through school and was thinking about what he was going to do with his life. And I think that's where most parents' limiting beliefs will get in the way, because a lot of parents would say, start out with what he can't do. Well, John's dad didn't do that. He just left the door wide open. And Mark said, and you guys got to go back and listen to the episode, and you can hear the whole story. But John said he wanted to design socks. Well, at that point, parents would also say, socks? What the crap are you talking about, boy? You got to get you a job. Well, as it turns out, now John and his dad, Mark, own the largest private sock making company in the world.
Oh.
And his socks are worn by former President George Bush, and they sent a pair to every member of Congress. And man, they're just going great gangbusters simply because they didn't look at him and say, oh, well, too bad, so sad, you have Down syndrome, you have this disability, you'll never accomplish this, that, or the other. The sky's the limit. Einstein, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, the fish will go through life thinking it's stupid.
For all of us who are already here on this planet, our job has to be to value everybody else who is here, however it is that they're here. So I really, I agree with you in that we need to, and we have to make sure that we don't think of it again in terms of production, like, oh, if you have a disability but you create a successful company or you do whatever, we have to make sure that we don't also only measure people's values based on those things, based on those metrics. I think just the fact that someone is here is value enough. Just the fact that we're able to be in relation to them is value enough. I think all of us, whether you have a disability or not, all of us are happier when we're able to create meaning out of our lives and to find our meaningful reasons for being. I wish that we focus more on that in our education system than, again, teaching these very specific skills that are essentially meant to, our entire education system is basically geared at getting you a job, getting into college and then getting you a job. And that just seems like too limited of a functionality for a whole human being.
Well, human brains, I'm talking to neuroscientists, but human brains function by building and searching out patterns. If something deters or is different than that pattern, human brains are engineered to assess that as potentially being a threat. If you walk up to your front door and it's, 9 o'clock at night, and you could have sworn you locked it, but it's open, well, that's a pattern interrupt, and your brain is going to assess and think of that pattern interrupt as a threat to you. And I think it's a comparative thing. Now, applying that to folks with disabilities, we look at people and we expect them to kind of be like everybody else. And when you're not like me, then maybe that's a threat to me in some way. And the brain perceives that. Well, to put some shoe leather on that, to help you think about that differently, folks, imagine the differences in you and a grasshopper. I know we're getting pretty philosophical, but in that comparison, who's the handicapped one? The grasshopper because it can't watch Netflix, or you because you can't hop as many body lengths as a grasshopper? See, it's all just perspective. Dr. Bibi, let me ask you, how do you look at folks? I mean, what's your perception? How does your brain perceive of folks when you work with somebody that has a learning disability?
We don't need to put this negative value judgment on having a disability. And in fact, a lot of folks with disabilities, and I don't want to speak for them, but my impression is that they're fine with it, and they feel an incredible sense of pride because that's part of their identity, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that
it's not abnormal for them.
Right, exactly. I mean, and it's not abnormal at all. We're just seeing it that way because we're looking at it again through our very narrow lens. And I think that's one of the main aspects of my work with kids, because they go to school and they're in environments all day long where they're being told that there's something wrong with the way they are. It comes back to, and this is why I talk about culture and ideology. It comes back to how we view difference. I think that you're right to some extent. It's about our brains have a pattern, and when there's something outside of that, the brain gets a little, uncomfortable. But I also think that, there are cultures that view difference in a very positive way versus as a disability or as some kind of, negative thing. So I think that that's a big part of it. I also think it's really, really important for people to recognize that when it comes to learning disabilities specifically, that is not related to intelligence. In fact, the way that we diagnose a learning disability is by kind of seeing a difference between what a person's intelligence and capacities and capabilities are and how their particular disability is maybe keeping them from that. So it's not related to intelligence. There have been we know about all the famous people, for example, who have different types of Einstein, since you mentioned, had dyslexia. But there's also been a lot of studies that have shown that there's a huge correlation between something like 40%, for example, of CEOs of companies have dyslexic brains. It's a very particular kind of brain that sees the world a certain way, but that then gets put through 12 or more years of schooling where it's constantly told there's something wrong with it. So I think in a lot of ways, the biggest work is in trying to undo that, not so much about teaching someone how to read, which is the same as maybe teaching someone how to ride a bike. There's that component of it. And then, of course, there's the other component where we know that there's a huge correlation between people who have dyslexia and people who are in prisons. Something about like 70% of people have, not specifically dyslexia, but have a learning disability. So, there's just no way that you can remove, who becomes the CEO and who becomes, who goes to prison. So there's no way to disconnect the conversation from larger conversations around social justice, around race, around economics, all of that. But those statistics themselves, I think, show that it's not it's not something about the dyslexia that is going to.
What a great point.
Yeah. So, and when you know that research, you're going to come to it very differently than when you're a child who, all in the world is basically what your friends are saying and, what your teacher is saying. And so you're going through your own life with the impression that there's something wrong with you.
And I think that's so important for you listeners to really boil that down maybe a little bit for you. What Dr. Bibi is talking about is if the causal factor was overwhelmingly dyslexia, you would expect almost everybody with dyslexia to go to prison. But since everybody with dyslexia doesn't go to prison, some become presidents and CEOs and multimillionaires, then it can't be the dyslexia. It's got to be something else. And we can actually assign values to the effect size of those different factors and see which one has more influence. And I believe what she's saying, and I would agree, that it's other things than the dyslexia. Well, what are some of those things? What else could it be?
For full show notes and transcript of today's episode, go to therapybites.podbean.com. Welcome to Social Media Smackdown. Tonight, the irresistible force meets the illogical object. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to reason!
Hey T-Ballers, Doc Heath here with another Social Media Smackdown. This is from a platform where a parent posted about having a problem with her daughter, and she said, my daughter is what we would call a natural negative mind. We have implemented things into her schedule to enhance her mood. And then she goes on to tell more of the story about trying to cater to emotions and stop emotions and get rid of the emotions. And then surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, somebody contributed the chestnut, teach her emotional intelligence. No one is too young to start learning CBT. And by the way, that is not CBT. But let's get on to what this post is really about. Emotional intelligence is a fad, and one that is long past its expiration date and in dire need of being filed away, along with phrenology, which is interpreting bumps on your head, and psychic surgery. You guys can Google that just for kicks and giggles. Here's the standard definition of emotional intelligence: the ability to understand and manage your own emotions. Notice how it skips right over what it is that creates emotions, guys, which is cognitions. The definition continues here. As well as recognize and influence the emotions of those around you. Now, if you can reliably do that, that is control the neurons inside of another human being's brain, because that's what it would take to control another's emotions, mind control, then there's a few casinos that you and I are going to go visit together. But this is just all pseudo-psychological clickbait to sell books on the subject. If emotional intelligence was a real psychological phenomenon, then cognitive science, all of it, would have to be wrong. And if you Google cognitive science on Scholar, you'll get about 4.75 million results in 1/10 of a second. Emotions cannot be intelligent, for that would be akin to speaking of follicular intelligence, or nasal, not naval, but nasal intelligence. Hair follicles, nasal cavities, and emotions are each important, but they have nothing to do with intelligence. Your thoughts control your emotions, and only your emotions, no one else's. And no one else's thoughts can control your emotions either. Look, take responsibility for your thoughts, and your emotions will take care of themselves. Now that's an intelligent, thought-based way of dealing with emotions. But if you disagree, punch me up with a text to 1-870-686-4196. That's 1-870-686-4196, our Therapy Bites community number, and we'll slug it out in a debate live on the podcast. Doc Heath, Social Media Smackdown.
What a slobber knocker! The winner by Psychological Smackdown, Doc Heath! No pronouns were harmed during the production of this podcast.
You're listening to Therapy Bites Art Lab, bite-sized therapy for your brain with Dr. Heath and the T-Ball team. The best advice on the net. No copay required.
Welcome to the Therapy Bites Art Lab library, where we have poured over thousands of volumes to bring you the latest CouchCrumbs quote. Oh, would you like a napkin? You're getting crumbs in the book.
That okay, me eat book.
Oh. And now today's CouchCrumbs quote.
Shylock Holmes here. Anxiety is my brain reminding me to breathe. A CouchCrumb quote by Doc Heath.
Oh, you got crumbs on the couch. Extra points for you.
Live the art life. Become a T-Ball Teammate Inner Circle supporter on Patreon at patreon.com/therapybites.
Here's Heath and the T-Ball team.
Well, I think one component is the type of support that you get. If you are a child who has certain resources available to them, it's going to be easier for you. And if you are not, then, that's a huge component. So, where you go to school, what kind of school you were in, obviously your parents' economic status, their resourcefulness, their ability to get you support, all of those are big factors. There's a lot of research that shows that, when kids have a champion, when they have one person who's willing to, who believes in them, that makes a huge difference in terms of the trajectory of their life. And, that person could be a parent, it could be a teacher, it could be a therapist. But essentially, all of these relationships, so the parental relationship, the teacher relationship, the therapeutic relationship, the success of those things really essentially goes back to the quality of that relationship. That's one of the things that makes it so difficult, because most kids don't have that. We can maybe reform curriculum in some way, but we can't necessarily provide that for every single child.
And beyond the curriculum, I think that you mentioned it earlier. You said it differently, but I think it's a prioritization thing. Parents, your kids need your presence more than they need your money. A lot of dads think I just got to go out and bring home the bacon, and moms too. But yeah, money is important. I mean, we all needed to get by, but your kid, when they're old, will never complain about not having enough money. Now, they may tell stories, as I do. One of my favorite stories, we moved to the state of Arkansas, and we had outdoor plumbing, which was really no plumbing at all. We had an outhouse. That was the toilet. And I love telling that. Did that lead me to have an adverse childhood? No, I don't remember that as a really bad thing. But what I do remember is the presence of my father. I remember him never leaving. I remember him being present for me. The greatest gift of a parent is their presence. I think it is a priority thing. And I love how you put that kids need someone to be their champion. And by the way, kids will sink to the level of your expectation. If you think that a kid, and you don't even have to say it, if you go through your relationship with that kid thinking that they are only capable of way down here, my hands off camera, this much, they're going to sink to that level of expectation. But guess what, clinicians? The clients that you deal with, the patients, they will also sink to the level of a diagnosis. Well, I'm not really diagnostic heavy. Diagnoses are labels that I've long since my own practice has outgrown, and they're good for billing insurance. They're just not really great for helping people, I don't believe.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And there's also research that shows that when the expectations of the teachers is low, kids don't rise to the occasion, and vice versa. I don't want to be unfair to parents, because I know that there are many parents whose maybe economic or life circumstances really do not allow them to provide that presence, like you said. But for those who have the privilege to be able to potentially provide that, absolutely, being present and having that connection with your child is going to be a lot more important in terms of their well-being than, like you said, money. So for those who can do it, that should be the focus.
Absolutely. If you can make the choice is clear. Share with us, Dr. Bibi, regarding how the brain changes itself. Share with us, if you can, some stories of what's really possible.
Sure. I mean, over my career, I've seen, I've had kids who've come in with a diagnosis, for example, of a specific learning disability in reading, and then after remediation no longer qualify for that diagnosis.
Oh, wow.
So it is possible. That's not the case for every child. I mean, there are kids who come in and, they make great leaps, but they always need some support, and they need to kind of be aware of their own needs and to learn how to advocate for themselves. So there's a range, but the point is that I have never in my practice had a student come in with anything, put in work, and then make no progress. Now, with that said, I mean, obviously my practice is aimed at, kids who are, I mean, they're already sort of functioning in school. So I don't want to say that this applies to everybody, but we do know that how the brain can make new connections. And what I have found in my practice is that the majority of time when you don't see those shifts, it's because it wasn't the right kind of intervention and it wasn't provided in the right way. A lot of things that we see, for example, in special education, kids, qualify for something like 30 minutes a week or 2 30-minute sessions a week where they're working in a small group, for example, on the reading. Well, when you really divide that up and when you really think about how much actual one-on-one time that child is getting, it comes out to like 8 minutes a week or something. And that's just not going to be sufficient. We know that in order for you, it's a little bit like building new muscle. Like you have to do it every day and you have to do it very intensely in order for those neurons to start talking to one another. So I think that that's definitely something to also be aware of, is what it actually takes to make the changes, and whether or not your child is actually getting that kind of intervention.
I think that the research on rehab and stroke really proved the point there, because if a person's had a stroke over here, right side hemisphere, that affects their left arm, if they're actually forced, and I know that sounds like a tough word, but forced to use the useless arm, the more they use it, the more communication between brain cells can possibly be restored, and possibly to a great extent. But I think that there's 3 main ingredients to that. And the first ingredient is practice. And the second most important ingredient I found is practice. And the third ingredient, of course, is more practice. And that takes time. People just get impatient. They want to skip ahead and hit a home run. And when you're doing remodeling of the brain and reprogramming the brain, there's I don't know. Do you see a lot of home runs, or is it just slow, tough work?
It's slow, tough work. And oftentimes it's very tedious. It's a lot of sort of like kill and drill.
What did you call that? Say that again.
Kill and drill. Or drill and drill. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of, especially for something like dyslexia, for example, where you're like really working on sounds and sound processing. I feel for kids. It's hard and it's boring. But, as you know, there is a principle in that we understand about neurons, and it's if you don't use it, you lose it. And one of the really unfortunate things that I see in a lot of, special education spaces is, that the work is just accommodated and modified so the kids can do it at the level that they're already at. And there's not a lot of, that kind of one-on-one, no, you need to, like you said, with, stroke patients, for example, like you need to use this and we're going to work on this and it's going to be uncomfortable, etc.
Grueling even, but I think that's why we have to keep the big win and what's possible in front of the person, because, let's use me as a kid who was a very poor kid. We lived in poverty, and I didn't know what was possible. And therefore, since I had no view for what was possible, I had no motivation to do really anything. And I graduated high school with a very low GPA, and it was amazing. I even got into college. But once I got into college, which it's the college I went to, it's called the Harvard of the South, Lyon College. Since I had people that allowed me to walk in their shadow, and thank you, Dr. Holier. By the way, he was my theology teacher, religion theology teacher. Imagine a religion teacher named Dr. Holier. And Dr. Braun, Dr. Weatherman, all those guys are great. Terrell Tebbett still up there teaching. They showed me what was possible. I think you have to keep the prize in front of the person, because you guys listening, what you're doing today with your neurons today is going to determine what your neurons, what your brain cells are capable of a year from now, 5 years from now. And there really is a bit of a Goldilocks zone. Do you find that with dyslexia, the sooner you jump on it, the better outcomes you have?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think with anything, the earlier the intervention and the better. But I don't want to, I know a lot of people worry, like, oh, my child is like in 4th grade or in 6th grade, or maybe even in high school, and that they have, they just got diagnosed. It's okay, that it's still definitely possible.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of times what you're fighting with a later diagnosis is all the years that child has spent, basically missing content. So, that's definitely one of the reasons why it's harder too. But I don't want anyone to think like, oh, it's too late.
Oh, never too late. I've seen, well, just take stroke victims. I mean, you have folks having strokes at 50, 60, 70, and they go through rehab and they still rehabilitate and regain a incredible amount of function. So yes, it's always better to start earlier, but if you don't, it's never too late to get started. On the previous episode that we just taped, I shared that I've seen people, and I don't know, this isn't a rehab thing, but I've seen people in my PhD program that were 70 years old getting their doctorate. I was just amazed. Dr. Bibi, in your experience, what's been your biggest hurdle on this journey to bring awareness and to really help people?
I hate to say it, but I think the biggest hurdle is usually the school system.
Yeah.
Because you have to fight to, either for services or for recognition, or, and that's really unfortunate, because, you want to believe that the school system is on the side of the child. And I mean, it's not that they're not, but, they are constrained by, a lot of other things. So kind of creating that relationship where we can just sort of put aside what all the jargon and the law and the this and that is, and just kind of have an honest conversation about, look, what does this child need, and how can we, to the extent that's possible for us, help provide that, sort of going from that first conversation, where a lot of times it can be contentious, to that second part is often the most challenging, but always the goal.
Oh, I completely agree. My father-in-law was a high school principal his whole career. My mother-in-law, who's responsible for getting me into college, she kind of had a dog in the fight there, because, as I said, my mother-in-law was my high school counselor. And they see it from a different perspective. That very decent, very wonderful, wonderful people, probably the best principal, the best high school counselor that you will, well, an elementary school counselor too, that you'll ever meet. But they had, gosh, I don't know what, 1,000 kids or something. And I was one. And, but I think your best bet is, instead of being enemies, approach it collaboratively. I think school systems and those that run them also need to be educated about what is possible, because they may not know. I don't think teachers get the education. And by the way, all this stuff gets dated very quickly. I started my career in psychological education in the early 80s. Goodness, aren't things different now in the early 80s? And things change so rapidly. I think it's up to the parents to be informed consumers, and to maybe you can be the educator of the educators, but do so collaboratively. What's the definition of educational therapy?
Sure. I mean, and it's really important to talk about this, because I think that educational therapy is not very well known as a field in a lot of places in the country. But an educational therapist is essentially someone who is trained to be able to assess, understand, and teach to the types of learning differences that we've been talking about. So the job of the educational therapist is to really be informed about these different types of learning disabilities and informed about how to remediate them and actually be able to remediate them. And then, of course, a big part of educational therapy is also advocacy work, because you have to be able to interface with the school and kind of manage the entire case. So it's sort of like, I would say it's similar to like a speech language what a speech language pathologist does for language related issues. Educational therapy is that, but more for cognitive academic types of issues.
Fantastic. I would guess that lots of our listeners haven't heard of that. Just a few quick tips for parents. If you're a parent with a differently able child, maybe some tips to encourage and keep them moving forward.
Sure. I mean, I would say the first most important thing is to do testing and diagnosis, because that's essentially what is going to determine the potential for services, for help. So I really want parents to know, because a lot of times parents go to the school and ask for testing and they're told, oh, your child doesn't need it. I want parents to know that legally, if they write to the school and request testing, every public school is by law required to test that child within 60 days. So it doesn't matter what they tell you. That is part of your rights as a citizen, a taxpayer. So I would say get the testing, understand the information. If there is a diagnosis and you're going to, what we call an IEP or a 504 meeting, I would say if you can, get someone to come in there with you to be your advocate. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone that you pay to do it. It could be maybe another parent who's already been through the system, because the whole thing can be very, very overwhelming. And then my other big kind of call to parents is to really ask for meaningful change. When they sit down to write IEP goals, make sure that they're putting in things that are meaningful for your child and that actually require meaningful change over the course of the year, so that your child is not just kind of like going year after year with really nothing changing. And then remember those principles. The principles of remediation are intense and frequent work. And maybe the school system isn't able to provide remediation, because that's not necessarily part of what they're required to do. So if you have the resources, try to get outside resources to help your child do that.
Fantastic advice. Thank you. And what would you say, and this is kind of off kilter, but kind of finishing up this episode today, what would you say is your favorite neuroplasticity hack?
T-ballers, time to quit your lollygagging. Get out of the dugout, onto the field, and live the art life.
I think everything changes when kids can see themselves change, be capable of change, because something about them believing in themselves suddenly makes the entire process so much easier and faster. And I do think there's also a connection, even though neuroscience hasn't quite done that research yet. But I think there is a connection there between, what you're capable of doing when your brain believes that you can do it. So I would say the biggest hack would be to start with something small and tangible that the child can actually understand and see themselves change in, and then get buy-in from them that, neuroplasticity is real. Look, you just did it. And then your job is going to be a lot easier.
That's wonderful. I love that. I would add to that, as you're speaking, I'm kind of thinking about this stuff. Make it fun and sit down with your kid and write your story in the future. Write your story of how your child is going to be in the future and get their participation in how their future is going to be, because that will give your brain a goal to aim at, and it will leverage resources to accomplish that goal. Build a picture, a storybook of how your future is going to be. I'll have kids come here and they'll say, oh, I want to live in a house like you live and have what you have. And I'll say, no, you don't. And they'll say, yes, I do. And I say, no, but you don't. That's just not being genuine, because you just told me you blew off your math test yesterday. That's the opposite of getting what you just said you want. If you're really sincere about it, then your math test is a stepping stone. So build yourself a story and hold yourself accountable for the stepping stone to getting you there. For more information with Dr. Bibi, you can go to www.oneofonekids.org. That's one spelled out, O-N-E, one of O-N-E, kids.org. And you can hit a / community / and it takes you to different pages there. But in 2020, the story behind that, in response to the school shutdowns and the isolation of mental health crisis, the pandemic, Dr. Bibi launched the Difference is Not Deficit Project. And the aim of the project is to build community through the power of sharing stories. You can visit that site to share, get this, talking about building a story, to share your story of what learning disabilities mean to you in ways you have experienced the fact that we are disabled not by our minds, but by the systems we live in. One last thing.
We journey now with Doc Heath as he submerges with our special guest into the depths beneath the dark recesses of the therapy couch.
And I've got my little piece of paper here, and we're going to ask her this alarming question and just see what she has to say about it. Okay, Dr. Bibi, you're in bed asleep in the middle of a dream of a world where no one even notices others' disabilities. We don't even notice. We're just blind to it. Everybody's their own person, their own individual. We don't even notice it. What do you think would be the first thing we would notice in a world like that?
I'll say this first. I think we already live in a world where we don't notice, especially when it comes to invisible disabilities like learning disabilities. But that's a side note. I understand your question. So what if I understand it as, what if we lived in a world in which we didn't give a value judgment?
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. And, just sort of accepted people as they were. I think we would notice a lot more of a harmonious world. And I think that we would probably be a lot more advanced because everyone would have been able to make their contribution and their way of seeing things. I think we would live in a much more interesting, diverse, different world than kind of this one lens that we have now. So yeah, I would imagine it would look very different.
Excellent. I think we would cure cancer. And I tell you why, I have a colleague and her husband is on the autism spectrum, and he really can't function without her out in big social settings. Just the fish trying to climb the tree, the duck out of water. But if you'll put him in a little room with, and I'm being grandiose, 30 computer screens, he's a genius, because that's his space. And I think if we, in a healthy way, became blind to just picking out and making value judgments about people being different than us, oh yeah, I think we would cure cancer, and we would have a colony on Mars and every other planet. And I just think this is holding us back. Hey, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, T-Ballers, for joining us. That stands for TherapyBites A.R.T Lab, where we try to adapt accurate, realistic thoughts and life-affirming beliefs. And Dr. Bibi, keep up the great work. You are making a difference in the world, one child at a time, and you have our respect. Guys, thanks, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye now.
Welcome to On the Couch and Off Our Rocker with Dr. Ima Freudnot, where we review our special guest TherapyBites A.R.T Lab episode, Psychomalarkey Scale Assessment Results.
That's PMS for short. Dr. Bibi Pirayesh's PMS performance places her in the 98th percentile on the PMS's NENNS, Neuroeducational Ninja Nurturer Scale. This suggests a strikingly, scintillatingly strong capacity for rewiring the cognitive cogs and gears in young minds, with an unusually, uproariously unique approach to rigorously reconceptualizing learning disabilities. Dr. Pirayesh appears to be a one-woman powerhouse of pedagogical prowess, tackling towering learning disabilities with the tenacity of a terrier and the tenderness of a Tibetan monk. She skillfully and splendidly soothes the synapses and tickles the neurons of her clients, transforming supposed shortcomings into super strengths. This dazzlingly doting doc is brimming with brain-bending, bias-busting techniques to help her clients thrive in the land of logarithms and law. It is my considered conclusion that Dr. Pirayesh should be prescribed no less than a 607 milligram IN intraneuronal dose of abilityamide and a 2300 milligram ED extradendritic dose of learning lavoxin to curb any creeping, crawling doubts about the diverse wonders of the human brain. Dr. Ima Freudnot, Chief Shrinkstigator, TherapyBites Art Lab.
Grab some of this episode's guest merchandise, specially designed to help keep this episode's message top of mind in your life. Don't forget friends and family members who could use an Art Lab mental boost too. Just go to therapybites.myshopify.com.
Hey, T-Ballers. Thanks so much for being with us today. If we brought value to your day, show us some love by leaving your positive feedback and inviting some friends to listen in and join the T-Ball team.
Government legal gobbledygook. Not intended as a diagnostic or as an alternative to professional clinical treatment. Resources and advice are for information and entertainment purposes only. Brought to you by... Someone saying things you don't like? Tape that nagging loudmouth shut. Government-approved speech tape. Gas tape. Now available at your local hardware store. TherapyBites Art Lab is not an approved, endorsed, authorized, butt-kissing affiliate of the United States Special Offense Assessment Police. SOAP Police for short. Warning. Consumption of TherapyBites Art Lab content by Kool-Aid drinking, stinking, thinking, social media, pseudo-psychological pushing, wacky woke anti-free speech mumbo-jumbo advocates may cause spontaneous internal skull combustion, stomach discomfort, and or laxative effects. Allergy warning. TherapyBites is manufactured in a facility that challenges nutty distortions, processes nuggets of accurate, realistic thinking, and life-affirming beliefs. This is the audio version of the legal fine print. Why are you still listening to this when you can catch the next great episode of TherapyBites Art Lab with a good friend or family member? Really? Are you still there? This is getting silly. Move on to the next psychologically thrilling episode of the best advice on the net. No copay required.
Me eat copay.
Yeah, with Dr. Heath and the T-Ball team. Go ahead, don't be podgoraphobic. Scoot, scoot, scoot. On to the next episode.